Hello students and welcome to lesson 5 of Python 0 to Hero series. Congratulations if you have completed the previous 4 lessons. And by now, you might be comfortable in taking the input from the user, doing some basic processing and printing the output. You also know that there are various data types provided by Python. And if you remember, in one of my previous videos, I had talked about that when we take an input from the user, by default, it is in string format. And if you need to convert it into another data type, maybe integer or float, we have to explicitly tell Python that whatever data we have taken, it should be an integer or it should be a float. This is what typecasting is, and this is what we are going to see in detail today. So get ready with your collab notebooks and start coding with me. So, when we want to convert data from one type into another, it's known as type conversion or typecasting. Now, this type conversion can be done in two ways. First is explicit type conversion, where we as the programmer explicitly and manually request Python to please convert data from one type into another. While the another type is implicit type conversion, where Python automatically does the type conversion. So we will see the difference and the utilization of both of these categories in detail. So let's first talk about explicit type conversion. Now, in explicit, as I mentioned, we are explicitly writing down some code and telling him to convert from which data type to which data type. For example, we have a function int. So when we use this int function, whatever we will write down inside these round brackets, that will be converted into an integer. Similarly, whatever you write inside these round brackets would be converted into a float, and here it would convert into a string. Now, whatever you write inside these round brackets should be a valid value. Like suppose if you are writing my name Sonal inside the round brackets and telling him to convert Sonal into integer, it will give an error because a set of characters cannot be converted into an integer. But if in the double quotes you write down a number like 5, which is ideally a string because it is in the double quotes, but now you ask Python to convert it into an integer, it will. So let's understand this with few examples. So suppose I take num1 equals to 8.9, okay, and then I convert this num1 into an integer. So I just write down num1 inside the round brackets of int, and whatever result it will return, I will store it in another variable known as num2. Right? Now let's print num2. So if I run this, let's see what happens. So you will see 8.9 got converted into 8 and 0.9 just got removed. So whenever a float is getting converted into an integer, it just removes the decimal part. Similarly, if I take a string value like num_str equals 4 and num3 is equals to, convert this num_str into an integer and print num3. Now, if you see, this num_str is a string. How? Because 4 is written in the double quotes. So if you remember, we had talked about this in our previous videos that if you include anything inside the double quotes, that's a text data. Irrespective of it's a digit, it's a symbol or it's a character, but it is considered as a text data. So right now, num_str is a string that is text, but if I want its integer value, I will just write 8. And now if I run this, this will give me 4. So int function works with either the float values or the string values which are having some integer data. Similarly, if we talk about float, let's use the similar code. Suppose num4 is equals to 5 and num5 equals to this num4, num5, all these are just variable names. And I convert this num4, or let me make it just num and num so that it would be easier for you to understand, and then I print num5. So what I'm doing here, 5 is an integer and I'm converting it into float. So it will just add 0.0 behind it, 5.0. So now it's a float value. Similarly, if I repeat this, and instead of num, let me make this num string value. So now if I run this, it will also give me 5.0. So this was a string, but it got converted into a float. Similarly, if you take a float value here, that will also get converted into a float. So the float function converts an integer into a float. Now that, and also a string into a float. Now string can be an integer or a float value. Similarly, if you want to convert something into string, now this function, the string function, works with a variety of data types. So like suppose if you have num equals to 6, okay, num str equals to str of num, print num str. So 6, if you will check, because right now you might think that it's still an integer. Let's check its type. It's a string. If I check the type of num, which is this, it is an integer. So this num str is the string version of the number which was obtained by using this str. So these are some examples of explicit type conversion. One is int, where we are converting any float value or a string value into an integer. Float function, which converts any string or an integer into a float number. And string, which works with variety of data types. Like suppose I take a list 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, and let's see what happens. It will also get converted into a string. Although it will look like as if it's a list, but ideally it has been converted into a string. So if you will print it and if you will apply string methods on it, which we will be discussing in our future videos, they will work perfectly on it because it's a string now. So all these were examples of explicit type conversion. Now, apart from these, there are many other functions which are available like odd, hex, ot, cat, tuple, set, list, dictionary, complex, which you can try in the similar ways, like you will write a number and try converting into a complex. And some of these functions like tuple, set, list, dictionary, we would be talking in detail when we would be explicitly working on these data structures. For now, let's move on to the next type conversion, that is implicit. Now, in this case, you don't have to tell Python from which data type to which data type you want a conversion. It will do the job on its own. But there are certain rules which Python follows to do the implicit type conversion. Firstly, it works on the numeric values only. That is, the conversion can be just on the numeric data. If you, for example, if I take number 1 as a float value, number 2 as an integer value, and try to add num1 plus num2. Print sum. Okay. Now this is a float, this is an integer. So automatically the result would be in the float. It will not be an integer, because if it gets converted into an integer, we are losing some information. And that is what the second rule is. It applies the type promotion to avoid the loss of information. So the conversion can go from integer to float, but not from float to integer. Because when you come from float to integer, some information gets lost. Similarly, if we try to add string and an integer, like num1 equals 5. This example we have already seen in our previous video, where we were taking input, which is by default a string, and then we try to add them. It gives an error, or it just concatenates, joins the two characters. I'll share that example once again. So sum equals num1 plus num2. Print sum. So see, one is a string, another is an integer. This will give us an error, saying can only concatenate string to a string, not an integer. That is, only string can be added to a string or an integer can be added to an integer. So this is the rule 1. Implicit type conversion works only on the numeric values. So this was all about implicit type conversion, where we saw that when we are adding a float and integer, it gets upgraded to the float value. It avoids any loss of information. Now let's revise one of the examples which we had talked about in the previous video, but now it will make more sense to you. So when you take an input from the user, input, enter the first value, num2, input, enter the second value, and sum equals num1 plus num2. Print sum. So now he will ask us to enter the input. Suppose I enter 5. Enter the second value, 6. The result is 56 because 5 is a string, 6 is a string, that is 5 is a text value, 6 is a text value. They just got added together. Like this will work if I try it with my name. Like suppose I write Sonal and I write my surname. It will just concatenate. So this data is not to add two numbers but to join any two values. Now, if I want this data, like I want Python to know that I'm trying to add two numbers which need to be integers. So I will tell him, okay, whatever input you are getting from the user, just convert it into an integer. Like I'm not writing down a separate code for it, but I'm just writing down the int function within the same line. You can do it other way also. Like suppose you took num2 equals to input. Okay, now you can write int num2, that is convert the num2 into an integer and store it in another variable, maybe num2 or num3, right? So that means in this I have done both the operations, taking the input, converting into an integer in one line. Here I did it in two lines. I took the input, stored it in number 2, converted the number 2 into an integer and stored it in number 3. So now I should use number 3. Now let's see, enter the first value 5, 8, perfect, it gives us 30. And this can be done in one line also, int num, and I remove this, and num2. So let's try once again, 2, 5, and it's not 25, it's 7. So this is how you can convert whenever you are taking the input. By default, it is a string. Now you can convert it into an integer or float or whatever data type. So that was all about type conversion. If you have not yet practiced with me, again I'll suggest you open your collab notebooks and try these varieties of explicit and implicit type conversions. Try taking various combinations of input and apply various type conversions on them and see how Python performs. In the next video, we are going to talk about operators. We are going to perform a variety of operations on the data you take input from the user, and we will display them using the print statements. So keep practicing. Happy coding. See you in the next video.